Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Edward Luce, an English journalist and the Financial Times chief U.S. commentator. He is also the author of numerous books, including his 2025 book, Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet. Mr. Luce, thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be with you.
We were briefly talking before you joined us about your 2017 book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism. I found that book alarming in 2017 when I read it, and I said, I hope this guy's wrong. I hope that globalization and automation, and I hope that those two things can actually lead to a growing middle class and sort of ladders of prosperity for working people. And I also hope that the rise of authoritarianism, which is leading to, at the time, Brexit and the election of Donald Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil, I was hoping that they were temporary. It seems I may have been wrong. Where do you think the world is today compared to where it was when you wrote your book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, so this is now sort of almost 9 years. Time flies. My publishers wanted me to call it the collapse of Western liberalism. And I said no, and I still wouldn't write a book called The Collapse of Western Liberalism, because even though we are further down the road today than we were in 2017, considerably further down the road towards a liberal democracy and towards a world safe for autocracy and for authoritarians, it is never game over. For every two steps we take backwards, there is a step forward. I mean, I think of the defeat of the Law and Justice Party in Poland. I think of the fact that the hard right Italian government under Giorgia Meloni is not as hard right as we feared it would be. And that, even in the United States, where I think democratic backsliding in Trump's second term has gone furthest and fastest, most crucially, in the last 12 months, you still see, very strong exercises in democratic response to this, with a small d democratic in last year's off-year elections, for example. So it's never game over. And the tendency of publishers and headline writers to say, right, it's all over, is I think, one that should be resisted. This is a continual struggle that marks our generation, our age.
I'm fascinated by that. I mean, just as a bit of background, I was living, somewhat in the UK, traveling back and forth, to Oxford as I was finishing my doctorate at the time. And sort of earlier on in my program, I had made a point of making friends with some folks, sort of who live in the surrounding parts of the city that are, not in the expensive villas that, are now, kind of the milieu of elites and so on. But, I would be in my department, which was of international relations, and listening to them talk about Brexit. This is back in 2016, right before everything was happening. And I was just stunned by their view of what Brexit supporters thought. And I'm asking about the sort of context in the UK, because I think it's, can shed light on what's going on in the United States. But I mean, just the sense among people in the department that the only people who would vote for Brexit were those who sort of didn't like repeating their order at Pizza Express, or, wanted cars named Morris again, or, preferred gooseberries to avocados on their toast. I mean, this was like, I couldn't believe that there was this kind of misapprehension of the depth of the anger just so close to, the city of Oxford itself. And it showed me that, perhaps in my own context in the US, we might be misunderstanding, what was going on. Do you think that that kind of breakdown is still a live one, or has there been, more of an understanding of those who I think might be voting for, or, cheering on some of these trends that you note?
Well, Brexit was, one of those things that sort of was identifying for people on both sides, Remain and Leave. It for a while was the equivalent of bringing up Trump at a Thanksgiving dinner. There's just no point in discussing this, because families would be divided, including mine, by the way. and temperature was just too high. Gradually, though, it's sort of morphed slowly, bit by bit, in the last few years into what I call Regrexit. If you look at public opinion in Britain, it's now comfortably more than 60% would like to return to the European membership. That isn't to say it's likely to happen, because the largest party now in Britain, at least according to opinion polls, is Reform, which is Nigel Farage's party. And there are complications over the fact that Brexit happened, but immigration didn't stop. In fact, immigration doubled. And, this is a real problem for centre-left parties around the world, that when you've got low growth, high immigration is not a good idea. The politics of scapegoating and of zero-sum, blame shifting becomes much more live. And so the fact that Britain and the United States have not been able to get a grip on immigration inflows is a time bomb underneath the centre left and the centre right, for that matter, of politics as normal. So I'm giving you a slightly divergent answer, because there is still that Regrexit thing, and there is still the sort of plain fact that Britain went from being, I think, the second fastest growing economy in the G7 after the United States to now consistently the lowest growing in the G7. And people, I think, correctly attribute that to Britain divorcing itself from the largest market in the world on its doorstep.
Well, with globalization, immigration increases were always sort of inevitable. What did the elites get wrong around 2000 when we began implementing things like NAFTA and other trade deals around the world? This should have been foreseen. What could they have done differently at the time?
So I think the year 2000 in particular, that's the year that the negotiations for China's accession to the WTO are concluded, and I think it joins the next year. The late 90s, early 2000s, up to really, I guess, 9/11 is where we sort of mark the change, is that period of Western triumphalism, particularly the Anglo sort of English-speaking world's triumphalism, that not only had we won the Cold War, but that we had produced the model that everybody else should aim for. And that this model involved gradual democratization as you move up the value-added chain. Because the more you get from manufacturing into services, the more freedom of thought and debate you need to generate the creative ideas that sustains a service-led economy. And that was a sort of a teleological, I think, ideological view of history. Teleological is, the idea that we've got a single destination, from the Greek telos. It, in retrospect, looks like a hopelessly naive, ideologically tinted view of how the world actually works, which is a lot messier. Would we have refused China entry? I think we would have realized that even though China had sort of fulfilled the conditions we negotiated with it, and they were not very different to, say, the conditions South Korea negotiated, or other tiger economies in the Asia Pacific, that the fact that China is 20 times their size meant we should have approached this question very differently. But we were blinded, had blind faith that everybody's on the same escalator. We're at the top of the escalator. They're just sort of getting onto it, and they'll be coming up to where we are. They will democratize. And that was a sort of hopelessly naive bet. In retrospect, some were pointing it out at the time, not many, but some were. But in retrospect, I doubt it's got any defenders left.
Fascinating. I mean, I'm a bit of an archivist in my spare time. I continue to work on little academic projects here and there, and I'll never forget finding in the Clinton Library this remarkable essay by Isaiah Berlin, sort of right as the Cold War is coming to an end, and it's embedded in Robert Borstein's personal papers. He was a speechwriter at the time, and Berlin is trying to explain why he's so concerned about the resurgence of nationalism right as the kind of end of history party is kicking off. And his analogy is that sort of he thinks that the intellectual elites are trying to sort of construct this he calls it the Tower of Babel, and that they're misunderstanding that nationalism is going to be driven by some of these economic currents. I mean, I mean, I imagine that's a complicated analogy to pick apart. But do you think that there was, in some sense, a misapprehension that nationalism could come back, that it could sort of spring out, at the end of the Cold War, and it was at a blind spot, or?
I mean, clearly there is an international class of people who are now pejoratively called globalists, who generally, were and remain for the most part the elites of most Western democracies and increasingly of other countries, including autocracies like China and ones in between, like India, who have a lot more, or appear at times to have a lot more in common with each other than they do with the people from their own countries. The term oikophobia, which is fear of your own people, is the opposite of xenophobia, which is fear of outsiders. And I think there was a sort of justified suspicion that our elites are oikophobes. I mean, the Isaiah Berlin essay, I studied him. That one I'm actually struggling to remember, so I will look it up after we've done this podcast. But it sounds like Berlin, who was a very pessimistic liberal. His liberalism was very different to John Stuart Mill's, or to those of the founding fathers, which was a much sort of less bleak view of humanity. Berlin's is really forged in between and after the wars of the 20th century. So it's a much flintier and more skeptical liberalism that fears what human beings are capable of doing. And of course, the nationalist project in many European countries has delivered worse genocides than really any other part of the world in human history. So I understand Isaiah Berlin's skepticism and classic Berlin to be, the skunk at the party, because in that period, the 1990s, nobody was worried about anything, really. I mean, I'm only exaggerating a little bit, but the sense that history was over and geopolitics is a thing of the past and big power rivalry, this is a 19th century thing. The sort of serene rejection of everything we know about our species and its history was something that would have provoked Isaiah Berlin. So I'll look that essay up.
Do you think that the sort of communitaire spirit of Brussels, as it flourished in the 1990s, may have nurtured this perception of oikophobia, or is that pushing too far?
There's a fundamental problem with what is a very noble project to prevent any more wars in Europe. That is the origin of the European Union, the European coal and steel community in the 1950s. But there is a fundamental problem of democratic deficit in Brussels. And I think that's just an inherent, issue that is to do with languages. It's very hard to have a democracy when you've got, more than a dozen languages. It's pretty hard when you've got two. I mean, you look at the sort of quiescent now, but the continual Quebec separatism in Canada. You look at the Catalonians in Spain. When there are linguistic differences, it's extremely hard to have a sort of single democratic conversation. Europe is a Tower of Babel, and so you're never going to have Brussels accountable directly to electorates. They're accountable to the member state governments, and that makes it easy to portray as an elitist, somewhat artificial, somewhat abstract project to create a European nation that simply won't be created. And it's a great pity, because it's a really practical and important sharing and pooling of sovereignty that both makes war unthinkable between its member states, but also makes each of them wealthier because they share a single market and common rules, and therefore they have scale that you don't have just operating within a nation state. That's all it needs to be. And anything more extravagant is going to fall on its face. And so I think we hear less of the sort of European single nation state rhetoric than we do now. But yes, that was a part of the sort of holiday from reality 1990s conversation.
As Americans, we're fairly self-centered, so I want to bring it back to talk about ourselves. In your recent and exceptional book, Zbig, about the former National Security Advisor Brzezinski, you write that he had a sense that the Soviet Union at the time had too many internal contradictions. Their leaders were geriatrics, and they weren't providing prosperity, and it was inevitable that it would collapse. Looking to today, do you think that the U.S. has too many internal contradictions? Again, ruled by the gerontocracy, prosperity is limited to the top 1%, sometimes top 0.1%. Do you think we're arguably in the same place that the Soviet Union was 35 years ago? And do you think that Brzezinski would share that view today?
I don't think Brzezinski would share that view today. I mean, he died in 2018. So, when people ask me what would Zbig do, basically the passage of time is sufficient that I can smuggle my own views in and pretend that's what Brzezinski would have said. He was in his sort of final 20, 25 years, really after the Cold War, increasingly skeptical of America's direction. Part of that was moral. I mean, in his sort of famous correspondence with Pope John Paul II, they always talked of this permissive cornucopia, a phrase Brzezinski coined, which the Pope liked. And that was a sort of, I guess, a critique of the culture of instant gratification that's moving away from the saving to spending, that is just a lot less disciplined and resilient than the West used to be. And that really concerned him. And in America, because he was American and was living here, he was particularly concerned about what he saw signs of cultural decay in the United States. But I don't think he would have seen, even today, were he alive, anything equivalent to what he called the Achilles heel of the Soviet Union. And that Achilles heel was all these nations who felt unjustly sort of Russified, that they were under a Russian yoke, dressed up in Marxist clothing, but that essentially they were part of a Russian empire in which, they didn't really have much say. And that was an Achilles heel that he spent his career really weaponizing through human rights and peaceful engagement, through Solidarity, Helsinki, and all these tools to try and undermine the Soviet Union. America is different. America is not a conglomeration of national republics. It's a single republic. It's not a confederation. It's a federal republic, which is based uniquely on a creed, not on a sort of organic blood and soil ethnic idea of the nation. And I think what he would be concerned about is that when the country is so divided on what that creed actually means, up to and including its founding documents in the U.S. Constitution and the Federalist Papers, then it becomes very, very fragile. So the Soviet Union splintered into dozens of republics. America is really two republics we're looking at, and they are disturbingly diverging in what they think America is. And I think that would deeply concern him. I don't know whether he would be anticipating civil war or anything quite that dramatic, but he would be disturbed by America's trajectory. When you have two nations expressing this degree of contempt towards each other, it's not a good sign.
Right. I mean, I do think in some ways, I must confess, I've now sort of been at the Library of Congress, looking at, some of the really marvelous aspects of his, papers that have been released. I'm amazed how he sort of understood at perhaps a deep kind of complicated level that the United States is in some sense this tribe of tribes. And he was sort of stoking, Polish ethnic elites to come to the U.S. government and push back on what seemed to be Strobe Talbot's initial, real desire that the United States not do NATO expansion. And I wonder, do you think that he saw that, as part of the strength of the country, or was it, something he was doing opportunistically, or how do you?
Well, I mean, he was an unapologetic Polish American, and he spent a lot of his career, fighting off allegations of inherent bias against Russia because of his Polish antecedents. generally from WASPs, generally from Anglo-Americans, who didn't see themselves as having a hyphenation. They saw themselves just as American, and I think he saw them as Anglo-American. So yeah, he mobilized and spoke for and used the sort of resources of Polish American communities to push for that initial NATO expansion under Clinton in the 90s, that included Czechoslovakia and Hungary, a very different kind of Hungary, by the way, in those days. And Czechoslovakia, of course, was the birthplace of Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, and Brzezinski's protege. She'd been his doctoral student at Columbia in the 1960s. And she also mobilized sort of some of what used to be called ethnic voting constituencies for the East European in the Midwest, in Milwaukee, Chicago, etc. And it worked. But it's a sort of complicated question. I mean, Brzezinski's relationship with hyphenated American lobby groups, including pro-Israeli Jewish American groups like AIPAC, he had very bad relations with them. I guess he was pretty skeptical of the power, but again, admiring of the mobilizational skills of Cuban Americans, as Israeli Jewish Americans, to some extent Taiwanese Americans. He saw that just as a normal way of doing geopolitics in Washington, D.C., but not really as the explanation for America's creed. This is sort of at a different level.
I see. I mean, I'm also fascinated by General Autumn's diaries, which, for whatever reason, you can view, just as Word documents on a computer down at the Library of Congress. And I'm stunned by, kind of his trajectory, to the extent you might think it's a sort of proxy for Zbig, because, Autumn was the sole general to go before Congress and, really extol his belief that the Iraq War would be a terrible catastrophe. And he did this while, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and which of course is known for having, a different opinion now among, who staffs it. But, I just mentioned this because I wonder, do you think that given how much of an apostate Zbig was throughout his career, is it that we really have him as the last grand strategist, or is it that the sort of foreign policy community in the United States doesn't tolerate apostates like him who offer sort of grand strategic insights?
It is a little bit of a chicken and egg there. I think it's easier to be a grand strategist when you have a bipolar world and they're ideological loggerheads. So it just does sort of command, the situation commands the need for grand strategists. More obviously. That said, a multipolar world is a lot more dangerous. It's a lot harder to find an equilibrium that doesn't lead to, World War III. And therefore, the need for grand strategists is even greater. But the ease with which you can produce workable global theories of the case is just much, much more difficult, because it's a much more volatile, it's a much more variegated world that we're moving into. I call it the revenge of geopolitics. And we're also, living in a democracy here in the United States today that is much, much more partisan on everything. And politics doesn't stop at the water's edge. Indeed, politics allegedly or fictitiously or otherwise involves the invitation of direct foreign power interference in our elections. Now, whether you believe or not in the Russian sort of gray zone operations in American social media, or whether, like me, you accept they happened, but actually, really, America did it all by itself. This was just chucking a little bit of oil on the fire. This is not something that was conceivable during the Cold War. So it's much harder to be a non-partisan grand strategist in today's Washington. I don't think it's a reflection on the sort of decline of American brain power. There are a lot of really sharp minds out there. There's still a great supply.
Well, they're not in Congress, so.
But they're not. There's not much demand for them, is my point.
Yes. And George, feel free to continue. I love this line of questioning, but we've diagnosed the problems for how we've gotten here: globalization, xenophobia, xenophobia, etc., automation. But where do we go from here? I think there's a lot of people in the U.S. who are unhappy, who will continue to flock towards the ideas of someone like Trump, whether it's him or someone else. What does the US and the world need to do to recover to get a sense of normalcy where ideas like democracy and globalization are accepted, embraced, and can help everyone succeed?
It's very difficult to sort of prescribe a simple 2-3 bullet point solution to the deep quandary that we have created for ourselves. At a time, a quarter of the way through Donald Trump's presidency, when there is a full-blown assault on the institutions that are key to the functioning of this constitutional republic, and during which, at a time when Congress has kind of abdicated its role as the first branch of government, Article 1 seems to be hypothetical nowadays. And Article 3 is highly questionable given the Supreme Court's rulings, most notably its 2024 ruling, giving pretty much blanket immunity to anything the US president does. And so, whilst the United States is backsliding to this degree, and whilst these institutions are under assault with this ferocity, it's quite hard to see beyond anything other than removing Trump as being a sine qua non, an absolutely essential step towards America regaining an ability to provide a broad-based democratic prosperity. We are moving very fast away from that. You would need a Democratic Party to, I think, be doing a lot more soul-searching and a lot more sort of revisiting of first principles than I yet see evidence of. And an example of this, since so much of the problems that the United States has, it shares to one degree or another with other democracies. An example of this is Britain's Labour Party is in government, but it doesn't seem to know why. And the longer it doesn't know why, the more Britain's Donald Trump, Nigel Farage looks poised to become the next prime minister. So, the establishment has been shocked, and by establishment, I loosely mean sort of center-right, center-left parties, what the Republicans used to be, and the Democrats and Social Democrats and Christian Democrats and Conservatives and Labour. They're shocked, but clearly not shocked enough to do this sort of urgent restructuring of their approach to politics that is needed.
I just had a brief follow-up on this, if you don't mind, which is, I think you describe well and I know I'm obsessed with the book, but The Retreat of Western Liberalism, how Trump was a symptom of where we are, not a cause. But the underlining, or he was a result of the symptom, but the underlining symptoms are still there. Do you not think it would require some sort of, this may be grandiose, but collapse or revolution? Because otherwise, nothing else is going to halt income inequality and millions and billions of people feeling like they have no path forward.
Yeah, and we've not, and it's just as well because I wouldn't have anything original to say, but we've not discussed the impact of AI on all of this, which is incipient but will accelerate, and I don't think it's going to make it easier, and that's the understatement of the week. The symptoms that led to Trumpism and led to, nationalist populism in other democracies are, if anything worse, AI will exacerbate those further still in dramatic ways we can't really begin to anticipate. And history would tell you that at instances of, this degree of inequality and this degree of public skepticism about their ruling class, their establishment, ends in war or revolution. We have to pray that that we're on a different historical trend here, because war is unaffordable. It's just simply any serious war between great powers is unthinkable in terms of sort of extinction level risks. And revolution, well, be careful what you wish for. What kind of revolution? Do you want a revolution, that in which it's actually the far right that take over? I mean, I wouldn't want to have left wing revolution either. you can do the sums between fascism and communism as to which caused more deaths. But there's no other ideology in history that compares to those two. So we're going to have to find a new way out of the woods, and that is hopefully with the democratic culture that we still retain some of.
Okay. Well, I want to respect your time. Thank you so much for your insights. And for our listeners, where can they follow your continued work?
Well, I'm Financial Times U.S. national editor, so chiefly there. But I'm speaking here and there the whole time. At events or on TV or whatever. So it's very hard to shut me up.
Me as well, but my insights are not quite as good. But Edward Luce, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth, and be sure to share with your friends, and tune in next time.